Thanks so much for joining us today. It's Devin Rose here from the Host Broker, joined by Larry Cobrin from MSPCFO and also Heartland Ross from the Host Broker. We're really excited to have Larry on today to tell us about MSPCFO and the benefits for MSP owners and operators like yourselves. So to start off the webinar today, Larry, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about MSPCFO?
Sure. So it depends how much time you have. Uh, Before I started MSPCFO, I kind of had a journeyman's background. I worked in a bunch of different industries. My wife would say my last real job ended around 2010. And shortly after that, I started this company with actually a friend of my wife. We started as a consulting company trying to help MSPs understand where to find improvements in their business, help them build P&Ls by client. We did it on Excel. It was largely a consulting-ish type business. And what we realized is that a lot of the clients that we have were asking exactly the same questions. And there was the opportunity to automate and host it on an application rather than just sharing Dropbox files that we would build, sharing Excel files, excuse me, in Dropbox. So at around 2015, we launched our application. We sold our first monthly license, and we've been growing ever since. Our goal has always been to try to help our clients find actionable information. And by that, I mean, find places, have the information show them where they can drive operational improvements or financial improvements in their business.
Thanks for the detail there, Larry. So, do you mind giving us an example of a success story that you've had with one of your MSP clients who've signed up with MSP CFO?
Sure. And we've had clients that have been with us for several years, clients that have just joined us recently, clients that come and go for various reasons, most frequently because of M&A. As you're aware, it's one of the best reasons to lose a client, but it's still one that comes and goes. We have a client that I can point to that we can show over time. They have increased their effective hourly rate on average a little over $1 a month. They've increased their gross profit they earn per hour they spend serving their clients by almost $2 a month. Last time I looked, it was over a 36-month period. And to me, that's really the win. Because in our space, when you get to a certain level of maturity, you're not going to do something that drives, 10 points of margin growth. It's just not going to happen. There is a sort of ceiling to that. But what you are going to see is the opportunity for continuous small improvements. And the clients that use our system well have been doing just that. They're constantly growing, and the steps are small. But when you go back a year or go back 2 years and look where you've come from, you realize that you've actually gone a great distance. And we have several clients that can show over time where they've had that kind of growth.
It's interesting you mentioned the revenue growth per hour. What sort of metrics do you find that MSPs are usually looking to when it comes to using your product? Are there other metrics beyond, revenue per hour that they're relying on the most?
Sure. So it's actually not revenue per hour, it's gross profit per hour. So every hour you spend servicing a client, how does that come back to the company as $1 of gross profit? And we consider that to be the gold standard metric. How do you put time out and have it return as profitability? The important thing that we look at is not only is that super important, but you have to understand what drives that metric. Is it because your agreements are priced efficiently? Is it because you're selling lots of transactional time? Is it because you're selling products, recurring or transactional? Or is it because you're selling lots of projects? What we try to do is show them that number, that contribution per hour. How is your time being converted to profitability? And if it's not where you want it to be, why is it not? And then you start to go down a journey to say, let's look at the agreements. The agreements look fine. Let's look at the projects. The projects look fine. Let's look at transactional time. Oh, you're not billing for your transactional time. Now we found the issue. So there's not a single metric that I think people should use. I do think that they sometimes rely on single metrics, but we try to teach them the journey.
Larry, if I could just jump in, what pushback do you get when you have these conversations? Let's say you're talking to a new MSP and they're intrigued by this. Where's the friction? Where's the rub? Where's the pushback? I can't do this because, or this would work for other people but won't work for me because, or what does that look like?
So the two biggest hurdles that we hear about and that are real, and then we don't always hear about the ones that they're not always real when we hear about them. The first one is my data is not good enough. The data provides a roadmap, and if people don't use their PSA properly, which is where we pull all our data from, we won't be able to identify where the opportunities are. And when I say they don't use your PSA properly, it could be one of two things. It could be that they just don't enter their data. Their engineers aren't putting time in, that sort of thing. Or it could be they're using it improperly. And there are various ways to use it wrong.
So
Frequently, that's not, I'm sorry.
Just because, can you help them fix those things, or like
it depends what it is.
Okay.
If it's a simple thing where there don't have costs in the system, or there are gaps in how they use the data, we can instruct them on what they need to fix. But if it's structural, if their engineers structurally are using the PSA wrong, they need to talk to a third party. They need to talk to a coach or consultant so that they can really understand how to use the PSA better. We're not implementation consultants. We don't sell hours. We teach people how to use our system, and we know how the data works. But if they need to change their operations, they need to talk to operations coaches or consultants.
Right. And that, even if they were to change today, you need to look at data, and a day of data isn't going to be enough. So now you need them to change, implement, and then look back 6 months or something, or a year, to be able to have actionable data, right?
Exactly. And that happens all the time. We talk to somebody, their data is not good. They try to clean things up. We keep them on our teaser list, and then we reach out back at 6, 9, 12 months, whatever it might be, when they think they have better data. And we can look at it and let them, we always give people access to our system with their data, so we can tell them whether or not it looks good or not. I'd never trust anybody when they say their data is not good. I'd like to see it with our own eyes.
Right. And what do you find that you end up in situations where there's a systemic issue at a cultural level? So the culture is one of kind of there's a lack of detail, a lack of accountability, a lack of the management oversight's not there, and so even if the PSA is set up properly, people aren't using it properly, and now you're trying to teach old dogs new tricks.
Sure. So I wouldn't say it's cultural. I would say it's operational. They just might not know what they're doing. It's not like they are morally opposed to it, but you do need to restructure the way they think and the way they interact with their PSA. And again, if it goes there, we send them out into the industry to find a consultant. We have people we like working with that we trust, but there are plenty of people. One thing our industry is not short of is consultants to teach people how to use their PSA.
Well, Larry, you and I were talking before this started about some of the other industry leaders, and I'm sure we have a lot in common who we've spoken to over the years and had on our sessions, and but I agree with you. There's it seems to me I'm meeting new coaches all the time. So good. Well, interesting. Thank you.
So what sort of size companies typically are you working with in order for them to produce detailed profitability reports, like but profitability by service, and maybe even like resource utilization?
Sure. So it's an interesting question you ask, and I would actually say that it's not exactly what the most important thing is. Operational maturity is the most important thing. We've seen $20 million companies where their data is an absolute disaster, and we've seen $1 million companies where it's military chip shape, ready to go. So when people talk about size as being a proxy for maturity, I frequently pull back because I say that's not been our experience. There's a very slight correlation. So the size of the company when they should have it is probably when you're exceeding 3 to 5 engineers. Because at that point, your business is starting to get complicated. The owner doesn't always know what's going on in every corner. And you need to have reports that highlight that. When you're a one-person shop, you know all of your clients. You kind of know what all the issues are, and you're probably right. As that grows, the complexity of your business demands that you have the ability to drill into it a little bit deeper to understand what's going on.
So, Larry, I have this conversation reasonably frequently with buyers and sellers, but we do end up with some buyers who, and these, I'll be candid, tend to be the buyers that are looking for larger deals, or typically look for larger deals. They may be financial buyers of one sort or another, and maybe they're looking now to do, let's say, a tuck-in. And so they're coming in with these expectations of having done larger deals where, as you say, is military precision. They come into these smaller guys, they want to do a tuck-in, it's $1 million opportunity. And they have expectations that these MSPs are going to be able to speak to profitability by client, by service, like line items and so forth. And of course, I think in all the years that we've been doing it, I've never seen anybody at the smaller kind of numbers be able to drill down to that level of detail. And so the expectation that the smaller MSPs should have or do have that level of detail is just one that I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, because the reality is that some of these guys are, first of all, they're wearing multiple hats, right? So they only have limited time, and to the extent that they're putting time into the on your business and systematizing and putting process, it's taken away from sales or other things that they need to be doing. And there's a cost associated with it as well, potentially a hard cost, where they're spending, let's say, for argument's sake, $10,000 to solve a $100 problem, right? So they look at it, of course, as you well appreciate, as overall. Well, I don't know. I know that this much comes in the top, and I know this much drops down on the bottom, and so here's my profitability. I just sort of wonder what. I feel like there's a little bit of an elephant in the room, this whole discussion, and curious what your thoughts are.
So let me answer by talking about I had the opportunity to have calls like this with some people that I think are far, far smarter than I am. One of them was with Peter Kajawa of Service Leadership, and they have access to an immense amount of data. And what he said in our call was there's almost no success in M&A when two companies come together and their operational maturity level is more than a half to a point apart. People seem to think that, hey, this is a small business, it's nice, I can buy it, and we'll integrate it into ours. It becomes a disaster if their systems are just not in place. And the contrary, if you try to buy somebody bigger than you or more mature than you, you think, oh, they'll pull us up, but there's so much inertia. It's just hard to get there. So I think what he said, I mean, obviously he has far more data than I have, is that if they have the OML, you should ask that first. It's sort of like, getting the reading the spoiler alert. Is this deal going to work out? So
there are plenty of groups that are working with Paul Dippel's team, but there are also many who probably would glaze over at the concept of operational maturity, and so.
Of course, so then somebody needs to be able to sort of eyeball them and say, you kind of look like a 2, or you kind of look like a 2.5. And then sort of make that assessments against themselves. And if you're an acquirer, I would argue you probably should have some fairly good benchmarking in place.
Right. Okay. So what's your sort of response to this in terms of the requirements, the expectations to be able to have this kind of drill down?
I think it's required. I mean, again, on another call that I had with somebody else, with Arlen, he had Arlen of Evolve.
I know Arlen, yeah.
Yeah, Arlen Sorensen. What he said, and he brings a point up, and I know this from talking to other people as well, and inside the MSP, outside the MSP space, you don't just do a deal. You prepare for a very long time. You prepare for up to 3 years to get a deal done if you want it to go successfully. So if you're smart and you're working with someone who can guide you, that person's to say, listen, this is what you should expect. Nobody has asked this question of me today, but you should expect it in 3 months. Start being able to answer that question. Whether it's drill down, whether it's where your assets are, whether it's information about your people, it all falls into the same category. What your margins are, where your concentration risk is. This is all homework for going in to doing a deal.
Yeah.
That if anybody's unprepared for that, it's indicative of something else.
It's interesting because there are various drivers for acquisitions. Primarily, it's to grow somebody's business, book of business, but it's not only, right? So, particularly in the last few years, we've seen a lot of acquisitions be driven in a significant part based on access to talent, right? Someone's looking for an acqui-hire type situation, and so the customer base and everything else is great, but there's a huge need for people. So I guess it goes back to the reasons for the acquisition, and it's interesting to hear your comments about the fact that that if there's that differential in operational maturity, that there may not be the level of success. And certainly, I can appreciate going backwards, right? So a group that's more operationally, more operationally efficient as a seller than the buyer would be challenging. But I guess my thinking is that there's also a significant argument to be had around size, right? So valuation, as I'm sure you can have experienced, there's increase in valuations and multiples based on revenue, based on size. And so the idea of doing a roll up and being able to get from 3 million to 5 million to 8 to 10 to 12 will produce a bump. So even if you don't do very much to change anything and you simply just amalgamate those customers into your operation, just on the basis that you will be at a larger revenue figure will alone be worthwhile. And that's kind of the argument, right? So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts there?
Sure. So a couple things going in there. First, you're talking about something called, multiple arbitrage, where you have two $3 million companies and they're worth some multiple, but a $6 million company looks exactly the same. It's just 6 rather than 2 3s, is worth more than twice as much.
Right.
If they're 5 times and 5 times, maybe the $6 million companies are 7 times. Right. So by combining them, you pick up 2 turns of earnings. That's certainly the case, which even drives closer to say that if you acquire, you can just get that easily if your companies are aligned operationally. It is low-hanging fruit to get the additional bump up in valuation multiple by combining companies. You just have to make sure it's not offset by the headache that you may endure trying to retrain one workforce to match another.
Yeah.
And if they're very far apart, then that retraining is quite a heavy lift.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. Okay. No, I'm glad we dug a little bit more deeply on that. That's interesting. I think we're on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're starting off with a new client, and let's assume maybe they are on the smaller side of things and perhaps only really have tracking at the level of QuickBooks categorization, what are the first steps you would take with them, and how would you go about onboarding them?
Well, the question would be whether we would onboard them. Somebody who's not ready for us, we do not onboard. If we cannot provide value for what they pay us, we tell them, listen, however you want to measure your growth, you need to make that a little higher than you are. And we actually send them out. We decline to work with them. And we say, there's a lot to be gained from better understanding your business, having better data. And when you're ready, we'll take you back with open arms and have another conversation. But it's for us, since everything we do is predicated on data, if the data is not good and they don't really have good structured data within their PSA, we'd just be wasting their money, and we don't accept it.
So is that where you push them back to one of the coaches then to solve that problem?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And they could get, again, it's their money. They can get there any way they want. If they want to attend free webinars and learn how to get there, that's fine. They want somebody to hold their hand, that's fine too.
Right.
But, or they want to use another tool that doesn't care as much, also fine. But we as a company really try not to take someone else's money if we can't provide value. Somebody may choose to not accept the value and not use the tool. That's their decision. But if we go into it thinking we can't provide value, we are very reluctant to take them on as a client.
Makes sense. Well, Devin and I put together some questions for this session, and obviously other things are coming out, but I think this ties into the next question. So I'll let Devin run with that.
Yeah, so for a small operator who maybe, let's assume that they do have good data in their PSA, and they tick that box, but perhaps MSP owners, they typically obviously are running around, they have tons of different priorities. How about in terms of the actual use of the tool? If they're able to implement the tool, how do small operators get the most out of it in terms of actually acting on the data that is presented to them from the tool?
Sure. So the thing that we, as I said before, that we try to help the most with, and people who use our tool properly, we're really happy when they do it, is a concept of peeling back the onion. The concept, to put another way, taking a journey with your data. Saying, listen, I want to find out if I'm at 12% margins, how do I get to 13% margins? That's the question they should be asking themselves. Because to the point of valuation, if you make more money and it's a multiple of a bigger number, and they can get more money for their business. So what we try, if a small operator, if they use the information correctly, they will find clients they want to drill into, because those are the less productive, less profitable clients. They will find out why it is. If it's perhaps the agreement, they'll understand, is the agreement underpriced, or are they providing too much service? Once they go through all that, then they say, well, if it's too much service, what types of tickets are we seeing? Are there particular machines that are driving those ticket counts? To really push them to find out what the solution might be. We don't give them a solution. We point them as close as we can into the right direction. And big or small, that's something, if the data is good enough, it is very interesting to follow that path and say, hey, this is an agreement that's underpriced, or this is a client where there's a spiking amount of new user requests, so maybe you should price it a little bit differently. And making those changes, as I said before, is what leads to these small steps where when you look back over time, you realize how far you've gone.
So, I'm sure we've all done it. I've done it, and you hear the stories with SaaS software, right? So someone signs up for some tool, they create a trial account, maybe they move to a paid customer or not, but the adoption's not there, right? So they're a freemium user forever, but they haven't logged in 2 years. Or they're paying at some level, and a company's got all these tools, and then the accountant, CFO, looks through and goes, well, wait a second, how many of these are we actually using anymore, and what do we need to cut, right? And so I guess my question is, how do you address groups that have the best of intentions? They sign up, they're a customer of yours, but they're not really acting on the data, they're not using it. How do you, because they're not going to stick with you if they're not getting value from it, but they're not getting value from it if they're not acting on it. So how do you help them to sort of check in and make these suggestions? And I guess I'm just trying to figure out how you might mitigate those issues.
It's a great question. And it's one that we honestly struggle with, because you're right. There are several people of our client base. There's probably 3 to 4% that just don't log in very often, or it's been months, and they still pay us. And we always think these are, you refer to them as whatever you want, zombie customers.
Yeah.
And we want to provide value. So we go through our user logs, find out who's not been logging in, and we reach out to them. And we ask them if they want another review of the system. They may come back and say, listen, we need to go on pause. We don't have the bandwidth right now. But frequently what will happen is they will appreciate it, because they bought our product because that was a solution they thought they could utilize.
Right.
If they've not utilized it, we then go back out to them and try to retrain them to show them how to achieve that solution they'd originally wanted. So we try to be proactive under low usage clients. I mean, let's be honest here. It would be great if we signed up a whole slew of people that used our system regularly and didn't need any help. We're a software company. That's kind of the business that we had intended to be in. But the reality is our clients need support, and we provide that. And when they don't ask for support, we sometimes reach out to them and offer it unsolicited. Hey, can we set up an hour and walk you through the system?
Yeah.
Hopefully moving them towards that client that gets bigger and more confident and gets value from the system, and it can grow the bottom line and may need less help. We're always interested in investing in our client relationship, because we think in the long term, we'll find somebody who doesn't need us as much, will continue to pay us. And that's a great relationship. And hopefully all that's true is because they're growing their profitability using our system.
Yeah, no, I love it, the idea of reaching out to them. I mean, it behooves you to do that, and frankly, it's a win for them too, right? If you can get them to make these changes, presumably there's a bit of a positive feedback cycle, because if they're seeing benefit from it, they'll continue to do more of it. But Devin and I often say you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? So we have those challenges as well, and so someone signed up, but at the end of the day, they need to act on it, and that's you can only help them so far. But just sort of curious. Excellent.
Yeah, and again, we tie it back to the fact that they bought us at one point. They saw value in one point. We just have to remind them of where they saw value.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if in your system, one of your customers is able to see that one of their clients or contracts is performing poorly, not generating a lot of profit. What do you typically see the clients do? Is there a threshold at which it just makes sense to walk away, or do you usually try to suggest maybe upselling that customer, or what do you usually see when you have clients that are running into that sort of a challenge?
Sure. So the first response we generally get from our clients is, I want to fire this customer. There's something cathartic, I think, for them in being able to fire somebody who's not as profitable. We try to have a longer discussion with them, and we show them the data, and we say, listen, you're charging X a number of dollars per seat, which is about average. So there's not a question of you mispricing this contract. The problem is that maybe perhaps they're overutilizing you. And you have two solutions. You can charge them more. They'll potentially walk away, but you'll be getting paid the right amount for the work that you're doing. Or you can figure out how to reduce the amount of work you're doing to find out what's spiking in activity. And depending on what it is, maybe charge extra for certain activities. Like we see new users, if the past 5 years, new user installations is a very much a spiking issue because there's so much churn. Maybe a little less now, but there was for a while. So we talked to them about maybe carving out new users as separately billed and not covered by an agreement, so that they can get paid for that kind of work. If it is mispriced, if they're charging $100 a seat and on average they're $175, yes, they should right size that pricing. It happens, but much more often it's something about the client overutilizing. And there are many different solutions. If they refuse to standardize their stack, you can upcharge them because they take more time because their stack is random. If they have certain hardware issues going on, perhaps replace the hardware and reduce the amount of time you spend servicing it. If their VPN isn't working, maybe they have the wrong VPN, or they don't have the right kind of tools surrounding the VPN or the firewall. There's so many different solutions that we leave it to the client to figure out, but we want to show them where to address that time. Again, most people say, I want to fire the client. There was a story a couple of years ago. I was sitting down with it was actually at the time a prospect. He was a client for a while. And he said, I have this law firm. I'm about to raise their prices. Let's walk through what I should do. And we looked at it, and the pricing was about normal for the price per seat. What was going on is there was a spike in activity in Office 365. So what he decided is I just kind of needed training on basic desktop usage. He was going to schedule some lunch and learns. So instead of putting in aggressive pricing that may have alienated and lost a client, he invested some of his own time to maintain that client and make them more profitable. And I thought that was just a great decision, a great, interesting decision. Because listen, while it may be fun to fire a client because it may make you feel powerful or whatever the right reason, you then have to replace that client. And if you have one who's already in the door and already knows you, perhaps you can fix the relationship rather than having to start fresh with a new relationship that you don't know what it is.
Yeah, and over the years, and I must confess, I'm not the technical, certainly not a systems engineer or a network engineer or architect or anything, but over the years, I've had enough conversations to know that there are systemic structural processes that a lot of MSPs have that will reduce the ticket load, right? And so the accountability might actually also be with the MSP in terms of how they've got them set up. And you talked about the stack as well, and certainly the alignment of that stack is a lot of leadership around walking away from customers who are not willing to adopt your stack, right? Not wanting to support their proprietary systems or the vendors that they've secured, but rather have alignment there. And so I can see this opens up. There's a lot of layers of this onion. And I guess this goes back to our comments earlier around needing someone, a coach or somebody who can do a bit of a deep dive into exploring, which of these paths to go down.
Yeah.
So I presume that there is some reporting that you guys provide around, profitability when it comes to individual customers. Do you mind just elaborating a little bit about what that would look like in the platform? And also, what are the other most popular reports that you see MSPs using most often?
So we build a P&L by client in our system. So you can see the profitability up to the gross profit we refer to as contribution line on a client-by-client basis. We use the word contribution because we think of the retail metaphor. If you work in multi-store retailers, they refer to each store as having a four-wall contribution. How much does that store contribute to the profitability of the business? We use the same metaphor, except that it's not a store, it's a client. We also have contribution from agreements and contribution from engineers and projects and so on and so forth. But if you look at the overall contribution, you can then see what the value of that relationship is. And going back to the metric I used before, staying also with the retail metaphor, in retail, they talk about sales per square foot. Because if you have a bigger store, it's obviously going to do better than a smaller store. So it's not really fair to say sales versus sales. You have to normalize it, saying sales per square foot. We do the same thing as well, but it's not just contribution, it's contribution per hour invested in the client. Because your hours are somewhat interchangeable. So when you send them out into the workforce, into the world, you want that time coming back to you as profitability. And if you have a bigger client that consumes more hours, you want to make sure proportionately they are offering you more profitability, more contribution. It's a sort of optimization problem. How do you maximize your profitability given the constraint that you have a fixed number of hours? And that really is most MSP's problem, is that staffing, having enough techs. So you really want to make sure you get as much as you can out of the people you have.
So it seems to me we see a lot of situations where MSPs will have a legacy customer base, right? And the legacy customers may or may not be priced at where new customers are coming in today.
Sure.
And so you end up with a situation I can see just as you're talking, where hours are spent on these on a large or multiple legacy customers. So there's a lot of time. And so from a profitability perspective, you look at it and say, well, geez, we're making a lot of money there. But when we look at it on a per hour basis, for the contribution margin of those customers and the time, those employees would be better servicing some of the newer customers because they're more profitable per hour. So I could see some of these types of things coming out, right?
Absolutely. If you have a client that consumes 1,000 hours and you make $50 an hour of profitability per hour, well, that's $50,000.
Yeah.
If your average for new clients is $100 an hour, you may want to figure out what to do with that $50 an hour client, because you might be able to get two $500 clients that are producing $100 an hour, and you can stop working with $50,000 of profitability with one client and replace it with $100,000 over two.
And that goes back to the comment earlier. Do you let them go? Or do you raise their prices? Or do
you limit what's covered by the agreement to say, listen, not all these work types are going to be covered. You'll pay hourly for some of this stuff.
Right.
We often find that clients that offer sort of a silver, gold, platinum underprice their platinum. They underprice the truly all you can eat.
I was just going to say the all you can eat. Yeah. Those can be dangerous.
Yeah, when you find out you're like fixing the boss's kid's GoPro, you wonder if that was really under the scope of the agreement.
I like that example. Yeah, and of course this goes into discussions around contracts too, right? Because some of these customers we've seen, particularly some of the larger ones and legacy ones, they can be on longer term contracts. So now you're stuck. You just renewed this customer you've brought this to light, and here's your issue. And I can imagine MSP owners going, well, this is great, except for the fact that we just renewed this customer for another 3 years under this term. So not much we can do for 3 more years.
Yeah, they are bound by law.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
So many of our viewers are going to be MSPs who are interested in selling their businesses and ultimately interested in increasing their valuation for when they are ready to sell. So I was curious about, how do you see the data that's provided by MSPCFO contributing to an increase in valuation?
Sure. So typically valuation, as long as they're not some crazy extraneous factors, it's usually some multiple times the earnings. If you have a small, slow growth company, that multiple is going to be smaller rather, and you're multiplying it by a small number, a small amount of earnings. If it's a higher, larger, faster growing company, the multiple will be bigger and the earnings will be bigger. So you kind of want to always fall into the faster growing, bigger companies. It's just the market rewards you. So what we can suggest is, let's say that you have 3 engineers that do 3,600 hours a year of client work. Give or take. Let's say 4,500 hours a year. If you're making $80 an hour, oh gosh, I'm making math hard. That's $360,000 of profitability. If your contribution per hour is $80 an hour, you're making, and I believe that works out, over 3,600 hours, over 4,500 hours rather, for $80 an hour. If you can increase that to $100 an hour, now your earnings have just gone up by 25%. Now, even if your multiple does not get increased, your valuation has gone up by 25%.
Yeah.
That's where the real opportunity is. It's simple math. It's multiple times earnings. So either do something to make the market think you're worth more in terms of a multiple, which really isn't that easy. And furthermore, the challenge is, it's which way the wind's blowing. 2 years multiples were this, now they're that. Has nothing to do with you as a company. It's just the way the markets are changing.
Yeah.
But your earnings you can somewhat control, and you need to actively take steps. And you have to see it as a long-term journey. If you're looking to sell your company and your valuation's not where you need it to be for your life plan, you should take some time and try to grow your earnings. And say, listen, I'm not going to grow them in a week. I'm not going to grow them in a month. But a year, I will look back at all the small improvements that I've made, and I will see a massive gain, sort of the atomic habits sort of approach to looking at it. And that can really drive a meaningful change. People can potentially get the numbers they were looking for, but it just doesn't happen. It's a lot of work. And the question is, well, when do I start doing this? When do I start looking to improve my business? Right before I want to sell? And I say I would argue that's silly, because it is a long-term thing. It falls into the category of, when do you plant a tree? And the answer is 30 years ago. When's the next best time to plant a tree? Next best time to plant a tree is today. So if you want to improve your business and you hadn't started 30 years ago, don't wait to look 30 years out. Start today. And there will be benefits. Even if you don't sell your business, you're making more money, but you're putting yourself in a position to get the valuation where you may consider an exit.
Yeah, I like this point, because we talk about valuations all the time. I mean, as you can imagine, when we have conversations, it's absolutely not the only thing that's talked about. There's a lot of elements, but certainly everybody wants to know what their business is worth. And so we talk about multiples, but we also talk about these thresholds, these points of inflection, right? Where your business is going to be worth more, as you talked about before with the arbitrage. And it may be that this kind of kicks somebody into a different multiple as well, and opens up additional buyers. I think the other thing that we haven't talked about that's important here is I always say, a buyer, and it doesn't matter whether you're buying a business or you're buying a product, they don't know what they don't know. And so as a vendor or as a seller of a business, you need to be able to convey what your product does, what you have done as a service provider, or in this case, and as a seller, what you have done with your business to structurally to be able to sort of get it to where it is. And so I love the fact that there could be a story for those who implement these things, a story around, well, look, here's my P&L, but let me just take a pause for a second and let's just talk about like why it is the way it is. And someone, particularly someone who as a buyer might say, geez, your numbers are really good. How are you accomplishing that? And so, well, great question. For the last number of years, this is what we've done, right? And we've looked at this data, we've made these tweaks, we've made these changes, we've optimized, and I can drill down and tell you, profitability by hour, by customer, et cetera. That will, I can speak from experience, will significantly improve the confidence of the buyer that they that they are going to be certainly interested in the seller's business, and that they'll be be an element of additional trust and interest in that book of business. So I think that's another important piece here, that there's a sort of a distinction around and this speaks to operational maturity, but I think it's an important point.
Certainly. I mean, you want to dictate the story, to your point. You don't want the MSP saying, well, you should look under this rock, you should look under that rock. If
Right.
you know your numbers, you will give them the confidence that they don't have to find the issues, that you're aware of everything that's going on in your business. I'm not saying that you should misrepresent anything, but it's probably true if you know your numbers.
Yeah.
And that I'm sure in a transaction, it makes the buyer much more at ease and much less skeptical that this is a deal that's going to work.
Yeah, and I think it also provides that narrative to the higher multiple, because the first thing that they're going to zero in on is saying, okay, well, what are all these add backs, right? They're going to look at those and question whether they're true or not. But that's just an added factor to an already profitable business. So I think to have that story will instill confidence, and I think trust, and I've spoken about this many times in transactions, is one of the most significant components of a successful deal, is having a buyer and seller trust each other. So rapport is there and other things too, but so interesting.
One other factor that we see often contributing to a higher multiple is the percentage of earnings that are recurring. And the MRR from straight up managed services is typically gets a higher multiple, contributes more to the valuation than break fix project work or reselling cloud solutions. So is that sort of transparency available within your tool too? And can that be part of the story that sellers could use when marketing their businesses towards buyers?
Yes, absolutely. We break down a P&L based on recurring labor, recurring product, project sales, labor and product, transactional sales. We've actually had buyers approach us and say, listen, I'm thinking about buying such and such a company. They've agreed to it. They want to set up the API and they want their data in your system so I can review it. I tell them, listen, we're not licensed to give advice on sales. There's an onboarding process. They basically have to do it at their own risk. But we do get the questions quite often. Can we look at their data within MSPCFO? Because we do those breakouts. There is always a data cleanliness issue. But our system can give that answer. What is the recurring product? What is the recurring labor? The interesting thing is, if you have, let's say, $150 a seat of recurring revenue, some of that may be recurring licenses and some of that may be support.
Yeah.
We break all that out because I think recurring licenses get a different multiple than support does. Support is a much higher margin. So we take great pains to go line item by line item to separate out product and labor, and we actually separate out within an individual line item, because some people will say it's $150 of seat with $15 of cost of tools. So we say, well, it's not $150 of labor. You probably have maybe $130 labor, and $20 is implicitly the tools that you're giving away for the $15. So yes, they can use the tool to get that information.
That's this is another, geez, Larry, we could do another whole session by the sounds of it, but figuring out the cost of those tools is not that easy, right? Because a lot of these are purchased on the basis of bundles, right? Of thresholds. So the cost of adding another customer to use that tool actually is zero cost. But if you were to sort of come up with an average per user cost, so I'm just curious, how do you do that?
It is it's a much longer conversation because there are different ways that we see it. I will tell you, over the past 8 or 9 years of us doing this, it's getting much better. And I say that is largely, I would argue that's largely due to the increasing role of distributors and marketplaces that actually drop in the correct amount in the PSA.
On a per user basis.
Well, what we actually see is that quite often people will charge per user and their costs will be per machine. And there's not always a one-to-one machine to user ratio.
Of course.
And the tools that they buy from a marketplace or a reseller of sorts, who dynamically updates all the information inside the PSA.
Okay, so that makes your job a lot easier.
Makes our job a ton easier. That being said, if they buy 1,000 licenses and they only distribute 800 of them in a given month, that's a different story. That's a much longer conversation.
Yeah.
I have my views on that.
Yeah, well, that's where I can see the complexity. Look, Larry, I mean, thank you for the time today. I think this conversation was far exceeded my expectations. Not that I had low expectations for it, but it's been really interesting, and I think that there's a lot more here, and I think Devin and I are going to need to give it a little bit of thought to how we can talk to some of the conversations that we have with implementing some of this information. So I think it would be helpful for a lot of the groups that we speak with. So
always happy to help. It's a pleasure chatting with both of you.
Yeah, likewise. Definitely.
And Larry, if one of our viewers would like more information about MSPCFO, where can they find that information, and what would be the next steps for them to sign up?
Sure. If they want to find out more about us, the next step is to go to www.mspcfo.com. We have they can contact us through the website. It'll go through the proper channels, have the right person respond to them. What we always recommend is that before anybody signs up properly, they go through what we call we call it internally a free demo, where we import their data and we demo the product with their information. We do that for 2 reasons. One, we think it's quite simply more salient to see your own names in a demo, so they could see how things look, not client 347. It's, Joe's Crab Shack, if that were your client. What's the profitability of that client? The other reason, and possibly more importantly, we can also get a very quick assessment of whether they're ready, whether their data is good enough. Because as I said before, we don't want somebody's data. We don't want someone's subscription if we can't provide value. So we can do that right up front and say, listen, this is great. Let's see if we can start moving forward. We have some fairly easy cleanup. Let's do that as things go. Or, hey, you guys need to take a step back and work on some operational issues. We will be here for you. We're going to turn off the data. We'll purge it from our system. And when you're ready, please come back and talk to us. Because all we would be doing is a disservice by showing you our reports.
That's great. I'm glad to hear you guys are offer a demo. So we'll put a link in the video description here to mspcfo.com. Yeah, thanks so much for joining us today, Larry. Really enjoyed the conversation, and hope to talk to you again sometime soon.
It was a pleasure. You guys have a great afternoon.